take the first few slides, and then Brian is going to take over. I'm Marian McCarthy. I teach in UCC. I'm seconded from the Education Department, and I run a postgraduate certificate, diploma and master's degree in teaching and learning in higher education for my colleagues across all faculties and disciplines of the university. So that's from the arts, from medicine, from the sciences and engineering and business and so on. And my colleague, Dr. Brian Butler, is a wonderful asset to me, as is the DSS, the Disability Support Service. So Brian teaches on some of these programs with me and keeps me on the straight and narrow regarding what I should be doing. And it was a wonderful, when Brian came to do my course, I learned so much because in, let's say, representing knowledge in so many different ways, it helped me really to move on. Before I start, can I represent things slightly differently and say, in summary, about the salmon of knowledge, which I think sums it all up. And for those of you who are not, as it were, from these shores, the legend goes as follows. There was once a young man called Fionn, who, like all children, was very inquisitive. His parents were most anxious that he would succeed in life, and they couldn't answer all of his questions. So they literally gave Fionn away to two very wise women for a number of years to see if they could put up with his questions and answer them. But soon the women tired of the endless, wonderful questions. And so then finally they sent Fionn to the wisest man in the land called Finnegas. Finnegas was clever and had a little plan up his sleeve. And Fionn said to him one day, "How can I know everything?" And Finnegas said, "Well, I'm not going to answer that question." What he didn't tell him, of course, was that he had plans to eat the salmon of knowledge, which would, of course, mean that then he would come to know everything, since the salmon moved in the stream under the wonderful hazel tree, which is, of course, the main symbol of wisdom in the Irish context. And if you know Yeats's poetry, you'll know that as well. And so, he was saving that for himself. More of that in a moment. Meanwhile, Fionn sometimes was quite bored with the company of Finnegas and, was there really as his servant doing everything and used to spend his afternoons in the stream fishing. And of course, one day managed to net the salmon of knowledge. Finnegas was thrilled. He said, "No, whatever you do, don't eat it. I want you to cook it for me, and then I will eat it all to myself." Which Fionn didn't think was very fair, but he was happy to go along with this. Unfortunately, of course, as he cooked the salmon and went to lift it out of, as it were, the spit, he burnt his finger, and as you know, the rest is history. He put his thumb in his mouth, and of course, he was the seer. He knew it all. Now, we are still looking for, as it were, the salmon of knowledge, but it isn't as easy as putting our thumbs in our mouths. But however, I would go so far as to say that universal design is as near as we'll go. Because if we get it right that way, we can open up knowledge opportunity to everyone. And I have found the Teaching for Understanding model to be very powerful in that sense, in opening up knowledge. I start with that story because, of course, as well, it brings up the question of coverage. When will we know everything? And the internet has given us an explosion of knowledge. And technologies is the same, but there's a huge difference between covering, uncovering, and discovering. And the model I'm about to talk to you about does precisely that to help us. Now, the Teaching for Understanding framework is a model from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, which I was really lucky to be involved with for a decade or so. I spent a decade at the Harvard Grad School in the summers in the 1990s and into the 2000s with a wonderful project at the time in UCC, which again was funded by Atlantic Philanthropies, and it was about multiple intelligences, curriculum and assessment. And those of us working on the project had the opportunity to be at the Project Zero classroom every summer, and I understand David Rose was part of that too, in that Harvard work. And I've just put up for you here, and Brian will speak to some of these in showing how we have tried to develop this model with our own students, who are, of course, our staff. And there's a pedagogical framework in the Teaching for Understanding which says really ultimately, we need to remember 4 things when we're teaching, really. So we can hang on to that. The horse will run on 4 legs. And the key part of this is that it's a performance view of understanding. That is to say, in the doing is the understanding, as David Rose said this morning, in the active learning, in the advanced learning of it, is the understanding, rather than the traditional possessive view of understanding, whereby I give the lecture, you take it down, etc. And then that's a more passive approach. But the performance view, I need to do it, to own it, and that indeed links in very well with learning outcomes as well, which of course move far beyond the narrow behaviourist model that they're sometimes accused of. So that first element, generative topics, you'll see clearly, Brian will show you in a minute, how they relate so well to the UDL notion of multiple ways of representing knowledge, because you try to find a topic that's interesting and accessible to the students. So that would mean automatically that they should be able to get into it in different ways. And then you come to talking of your understanding goals, and these we should make public, and they should be, there for the students from the beginning. And Shira talked yesterday of how, giving the students a brief, and we talk of giving them rubrics, so making it absolutely clear, naming our goals. So again, putting it out there that we are going to represent what we are going to teach in different ways, and that we are going to engage them in different ways. Equally, we are trying to give them in the understanding goals the big picture. This isn't education for 3 or 4 years in a university. This is education for life. And there are the bigger goals, the bigger question of, what makes a good citizen, and the life and death issues that preoccupy us. And then you come in the planning. So this is all in the planning. The teacher is planning the course. So this is a design that is absolutely concomitant with universal design principles. The performances of understanding. So you ask yourself in your planning, not what you're going to do and how long you're going to be up there lecturing. You ask yourself, what are the students going to do? What are the life and death issues here? What do I really need to get them to do to show how they learn? And of course, that's about multiple ways of engaging them, as we heard so well this morning, in different ways. And indeed, the flipped classroom does so much there to get you handing over to them. And that's what Fionn, you see, or Fingus failed to do. He failed to gift the learning to the learner. He wanted to keep the knowledge to himself, to possess it. He had the possessive view, but we want, in terms of UDL, we need the performance view, because in the doing is the understanding. And in that sense, in the students' doing, they are doing it, as David pointed out this morning, in the many different ways in which he has the scribes working. They are making their own of it, representing it in different ways, and, expressing themselves in different ways. So the performance view of understanding allows for that complexity and that compelling as well excitement of the doing, where you make your own of it. And finally then, ongoing assessment. The Teaching for Understanding model prioritises assessment as ongoing. In other words, goes to the Latin root of the word assessment, which is assidere, to sit beside the student, not to sit the leaving cert. So it's about feedback that is formative, diagnostic, dialogical, that is ongoing and reflective. And so again, that brings about multiple ways of engaging the student, particularly in this dialogue, that the learning is lifelong and ongoing. Okay, so, and then I just give you there that link to the Harvard website, and they have done that website over recently, so you will find so much of what you want there to help you with this model. Now, we'll be talking primarily to that today, but I just couldn't resist the opportunity to speak briefly about the disciplinary framework, which for me was the gold dust behind the TFU model. The second model says, what are we trying to understand? Usually in the university context, it is some discipline, like history or engineering or medicine or science or whatever. And one of the things I have found very powerful is to be able to speak to my colleagues in a language that includes them all. And this gives me a currency to do so. So the Teaching for Understanding model says, look, all disciplines have these 4 things in common. They all have knowledge. In other words, the what question. What does the expert ask? What questions do experts ask? Then, of course, equally, we have the method. Now, not the method of the pedagogy, the method of the discipline. How does a historian think? How does an engineer think? And so we have to think as well that we're mapping our pedagogy and our UDL onto this, to revealing the complexity of the discipline. What is it to be a mathematician? Then the purpose. Why? Why would you study mathematics? What's it? So, and that's the tough one, the personal one, because purpose always comes to ownership, and ownership comes to ethics. We can use the atom for good or ill. We can use any knowledge for good or ill. And we have to think as well of the broad role of us as, ultimately, we are citizens of the world who can do great good in the world. or great evil, depending. And finally, the multiple forms of representing our discipline. You see, we have calcified the forms too much into exam format. And you could, in fact, the two we have detached, and we have done a lot of research of this in some of the portfolios in the past that we've received. And you know, college lecturers tell us, look, I have, if you like, dislocated knowledge and form to the detriment of purpose and method. And my best example of that was one of the GPs, the professor of medicine, Colin Bradley, when he was looking at the new programme, the graduate entry into medicine. He said, we've spent far too long focusing on knowledge and on form, and not enough about how to get them to think like doctors. And so therefore we needed more work placement, and how to get them to own what it is to be a doctor. You know, and that it is about as well patient care and so on. So I think that is the other side of the TFU model, that reveals the complexity of the discipline, which is in that sense the huge big picture that we are trying to clarify. So then, you know, this is a slide I've just passed over, that this TFU framework seems quite simple, firstly. And of course, that's again, I think we do need to give things simply for clarity. But when you go working on it, it brings up a lot of assumptions about learning and gets you to think of alignment, that all the pieces, the part in relation to the whole, and very often it's so easy with the fragmentation of modularization and of semesterization to break everything down and to miss the big picture. And so the TFU model helps you to do that. Then also, by the way, we have some lovely pictures of UCC and of different students at work. There's one here, a geminologist here, along the way here in the background, and I have written about those in the notes. So now TFU and UDL alignment then, since TFU, you see, also foregrounds multiple means of representation, expression and engagement, I have found it very powerful, because sometimes when you say UDL or when you mention inclusion, people think, as the gentleman said this morning, that you're talking only of, as it were, disability. And of course, I'm thinking of people as well as being differently able, rather than that there's any disability about them, but the disability word has currency. So I find the TFU a very, you know, good model for thinking of good curriculum design. And indeed, that is what universal design speaks to. And the active learning thrust, I'm saying here, at the heart of the performance view of understanding, central to teaching for understanding, invites each student to own their learning in a variety of ways. And then how we have tried to capture that, just as earlier our friends from Trinity were talking about the e-portfolio, where we use a course portfolio model based on Pat Hutchins' model in the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning, that's to say the world of the scholarship of teaching and learning. So I'm using the course portfolio, sometimes the hard copy version, but equally there's an e-portfolio. Some students, some staff choose to do it as an e-portfolio. Okay, so, and I'll be passing on to Brian now in a moment of this. So, in that course portfolio, we ask our colleagues over the year, in the second year of the diploma, they have to keep track of, they have to take a course and take it apart, one of the courses they're teaching, one of their modules, and design it, looking at TFU and UDL principles. And so the course portfolio asks you to look at the design of the course, the teaching of it, and the student learning of it, or design, enactment, and results, where results has to do with learning and not exam results. So these are the kinds of statements that we have in the course portfolio. I have reviewed the course in the light of TFU and UDL principles and included a graphic organizer and map of the course design. I have analysed the strategies used to involve the students in the light of TFU and UDL, and I have reflected on what I have learnt about teaching and student learning using the TFU UDL approach. So there are several, it's a very detailed rubric, but that just gives you the idea. So over time then we get them, and I give them the whole year to do this, because this is a key aspect of it while we're, you know, meeting at sessions. So they think of the course, you know, something they're teaching that they're actually teaching in the current year, and they review it in that way. So without further ado, we will now hand you over to Brian, who will make a far better job of explaining it. So I'll hit you here at the, yes, and here is, I have forgotten my glasses too, so in fact Brian is seeing a lot more than I am.
I doubt it.
Oh, okay. So you're at the Brain Network.
Thank you, Marian. Thank you very much. No, I'll just move on by looking at the 4 pedagogical elements of teaching for understanding. That's generative topics, understanding performances, understanding goals and continuous assessment. And I'll just give examples of ways in which they link up with UDL, or in ways in which they can serve UDL very well. It is important to say that teaching for understanding pedagogy is a reflective approach to teaching. It's a research approach to teaching also, so it can serve well to provide research on UDL if you are implementing the UDL principles within it. The UDL principles fit very comfortably within it, as we will see from some examples I'll show, but you do have to, it doesn't happen by itself, obviously. You have to be aware of the principles and the guidelines within the structure as you work through it. So I will look, first of all, they're just the principles. I will look first at multiple forms of representation, guidelines being providing options for perception, for language, mathematical symbols and or mathematical expressions and symbols, and also multiple options for comprehension. And I will look at that, and I will see what way generative topics can serve it. In generative topics, there are 4 criteria. The first being topics must be central to the discipline. Next, they must be interesting to teachers and students. They must have a variety of resources and entry points to learning, and they must connect with other topics on the course. The generative topics can serve all of the principles of UDL, but just looking at multiple forms of representation, within the 3rd criteria there, which is offering a variety of resources and entry points to learning. This gives ample opportunity for multiple forms of representation. It gives us loads of space for introducing digital media. You can, with a course website, it is quite easy to put up video material, audible material. You can have links to background knowledge. You kind of, I can't think now, but there are lots and lots of options with digital media. So you can provide, you can make it possible that the student can customize the information if they need it larger, smaller, different contrast, whatever. You can provide the visual material in other ways and audible material in other ways. With the 4th criteria of generative topics, which is connecting with other topics on the course, you can also ensure that you cover multiple forms of comprehension, or multiple options for comprehension, because there's plenty of opportunity here for highlighting background knowledge for a student and highlighting the different patterns, critical features, big ideas and relationships. So there's plenty of room in there. And with one student, for example, or one teacher who is teaching a modern history course in American history, a period in American history, he decided when he was reviewing a module that taking into account teaching for understanding and UDL, he decided to do the flipped classroom. He cut his lectures in half and he put a massive amount of material online. He had interviews, documentaries, original documents. He had all sorts of reading material. He was able to provide material in all sorts of formats. So he was really able to avail of putting TFU to use for UDL there. So looking next at multiple forms of expression, you can see the guidelines there. I won't run through each one now, but looking at the third one there, that would be number 6, providing options for executive functions. We can look at goals, at understanding goals. Understanding goals means understanding that a goal needs to be separate from the means of achieving it. There need to be several pathways to achieving a goal in order that all students can have an equal opportunity to reach that goal. Executive functions, ask that a teacher will guide and help a student in identifying the goals that need to be achieved, and also in laying down a strategy to achieve that goal. And different students may require different strategies, and it is also important to facilitate students in learning how to review their goals. So, the multiple forms of expression, especially executive functions, come into play in understanding goals. Understanding goals can serve them well. If we look at understanding performances next, understanding performances are performances of learning. When a student takes ownership of learning, it is where a student's learning becomes visible, and indeed feedback can be provided. Understanding performances are vital in the Teaching for Understanding pedagogical framework for multiple forms of expression, especially multiple forms of expression and communication, because every student has their own way of communicating best. The teacher who did the flipped learning class, he provided lots of opportunity for this also, because even though he had a lot of material online, when he conducted his classes, he kept them for discussion, he facilitated discussion, and he also facilitated role play and simulation, where students would take on, each student may have been given a different character from the historical period they were studying, and they would have to make that character's case in political discussions that took place. So they would work very hard to argue their own character's case, and they would also have to write, apart from the role play, they would also have to write a blog on their character, and this blog was available to other students so they could see what they were going to be arguing against. So he provided discussion online and feedback online also. So he provided lots of different ways of performing with the knowledge and of expressing and communicating the knowledge. So there's plenty of opportunity for using multiple media for communication, for using multiple tools for construction and comprehension, and for building fluencies with graduated levels of support for practice and performance. Teaching for Understanding also has 3 levels of performance. It has introductory performances, guided performances, and it has culminatory performances. So this is also excellent in supplying or removing scaffolding for students as is required. Next is that multiple forms of engagement that I have up there. Yep. So multiple forms of engagement we looking at the 3 guidelines there, we have multiple options for recruiting interest, multiple options for sustaining effort and persistence, and multiple options for self-regulation. So the understanding performances can serve this very well also, especially there in the first one, providing options for recruiting interest. Performances can provide a student with more autonomy and individual choice when they are when a teacher wants to engage a student and get them involved in having a part to play in what they'll be doing. Also, too, the second guideline there in multiple forms of engagement is sustaining effort and persistence. Within this, you have opportunities for salience of goals, to highlight goals to students and get them keyed up about it again during their performances. And you also have plenty of opportunity for group collaboration and for getting students involved with one another. So these performances can help multiple forms of engagement. If we look at the continuous assessment, which is what should be there now, is that correct? Yep. In continuous assessment, this can serve both the how and why of learning, because it's important. Yesterday I heard a lovely term, and understanding for learning instead of understanding of learning, you know. And it is in feedback, in continuous feedback, with formative assessment especially, there can be plenty of opportunities for formative assessment. And it's through that assessment that a student can review where they are. It can help in their self-regulation as they move themselves forward in their learning journey. And it's key that they receive constant feedback on their learning. Summative assessment also, it's important that that there are several forms of summative assessment. That it can be, I mean, if it's continuous, you can have different forms of assessment. I know there's one teacher there, and he made sure that he had about at least 4 different forms of summative assessment, and each of these were completely different, but they all carried equal amount of weight in marks. Sometimes you have lots of summative assessment, but one form may carry 80% or 70% of the marks involved. Whereas if you want to create a situation where students have the opportunity to shine in their own strengths and to demonstrate the learning outcomes within their strengths, it is important that this variety is equally weighted. I hope that has demonstrated. It's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour there. I've gone through it fast. But these are only examples of the ways in which Teaching for Understanding can serve UDL, but it can be done much more.
We have a paper as well, so we'll put some more detail in that, but we have yet to send it to Darren. We're getting there. We're getting there. Great, Brian. Thanks a million. They're screaming at us here with this number.
Sorry.
I am ignoring it all.
Marian and Brian, if only we could spend more time with you, it would be fantastic.